Let's talk action beats. What are your characters doing and what should they be doing? I'm Karen Beery with Right Now Editing, where we turn good manuscripts into great books.
And I'm Pegg Thomas, award-winning author and editor, and we are two editors for 5 minutes.
And before we get started, I'm just going to put a little thing in here and say that I am officially now also an award-winning author, and I'll
Yeah.
put that down in the comments. Very exciting week for me, but we're going to get started our 5 minutes now, talking about action beats. Peg and I were just talking about this, and an action beat is just it's the action before or after somewhere in dialogue that shows your reader who is speaking. And you do this instead of saying he said, she said, he said, she said a million times in your book. But there are some things that we see happening with action beats that can be a little annoying for readers and editors. So, Peg, you were talking about one of your pet peeves. I'm going to talk about one of mine, and then we're going to give some suggestions. So, what do you see?
Okay. Well, my pet peeve right now is all action beats happen from the chin up. People forget that their characters have an entire body. So everything is wide eyes, narrow eyes, and tons of head bobbing. I see more bobbleheads in books than need to be there. How about yours?
And what she's referring to is, if you have a character, well, that looks great. Beth nodded. It is. And then later on the page, Bobby nodded. And then Susie nodded. And everybody's nodding. It gets old fast. The one that I see that's kind of, I see this mostly when I'm editing. It's the action for the sake of action, but it doesn't add anything to the story. So you've got a couple that are talking, and Susie puts on some chapstick, and then Ben ties his shoes, and then Susie decides to dust the countertop. And you see people doing things so that it's clear to the reader who's talking, but they're doing all of these random actions that don't do anything for the story. In fact, all they do is take up space. And eventually it kind of turns into the bobblehead thing, because then you see Susie putting on chapstick 14 times in the book. Why does it matter? It doesn't. So, what are your tips, Peg, for writing better action beats and helping in the dialogue?
Best action beats are action beats that help define the character. So if you have a teenage girl, for instance, and she's one of those who's always twirling her hair, that's an action beat for one of your characters. Don't have every character doing that, but we all know that girl that would twirl her hair, right? And so that's a really nice action beat for one of your characters. You might have a guy that's constantly stroking his beard, or and again, these are all like above the shoulders, but you can do other ones. Maybe you got the girl that's constantly like picking at her fingers, that nervous Nelly that's always doing this. That's another great action beat for one of your characters, not all of them. Maybe you have a guy who's constantly tapping his foot or bouncing his knee up and down when he's impatient. You can use action beats that actually show more of your character's personality. Those are the very best action beats. The short, like Karen's saying, filler action beats are sometimes appropriate if you have a large cast of characters, just to help keep them in line, because you can't use he said if you have five he's in the scene, right? And so, and then you don't want to go into too much detail, but you do want to differentiate. You can use them in that type of a setting. But anytime you can show a little bit about their character, it definitely deepens your story and it makes the action beat much more interesting for the reader.
And a big thing to remember too is if you have a conversation happening in your book and there's only two characters in the conversation, the general rule of thumb is every time a different character speaks, you start a new paragraph. So if you have two characters speaking, you're going to go ahead and you're going to hit enter. You're going to start a new line when the next character speaks. So you don't need to have a dialogue tag or an action beat on every line. And in fact, you shouldn't. You can go ahead and have, especially if it's these short little back and forth quips that you've got going on, you can do 4, 5, 6 lines without designating who's talking, because the reader's going to remember. Just remember, your reader's always smarter than you think they are. They can keep track of who's talking in a conversation.
And if
Peg?
you only have two people and you have that quick back and forth repartee, you don't want any action beats or tags in there, because you don't want to slow that scene down. Remember that when you
Absolutely.
add stuff, you're slowing the scene down. So if you've got a rapid fire, witty back and forth, you don't want action tags and you don't want dialogue tags of any kind. If it's just two people, you add a third person, you got to tweak it because you got to let them know who's talking. But definitely that, especially if you're writing a romance, you got that witty back and forth between hero and heroine, just let it fly. The reader's
And
smarter
remember
than you think.
Yeah, and remember, it's okay to use dialogue tags, especially if you have a conversation.
Yes. Just don't know.
We're
Hey,
out.
before we can go though, we do have to talk about lip chewing. This will be just the freebie here at the end of 5 minutes. Nobody really chews their lips, people, because if they did, everybody would be walking around with bloody lips.
So keep an eye on everything that's happening above the neck. And until next time, I'm Karen Beery with Right Now Editing.
And I'm Peg Thomas, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.